Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. So we're going to keep moving on with this Unit 5, The Great Divide, where we left off last time. We have a lot of Americans who are moving to that Texas territory. We had Mexicans who were also occupying that territory. So it was going to kind of be this inevitable struggle as far as who's going to take control of that land. Okay, so Texas is going to be really one of these key territories turned states that is really going to propel the United States into this whole new era and whole new phase of the debate about what role slavery played in these new Western territories. And in general, that Texas territory, as I left off last time, was really up for grabs. It was kind of this weird unofficial buffer zone between the United States and Spanish Mexico. But once the Spanish were kicked out, Mexico was wanting to kind of take more control over that territory than Spain was even interested in having. And between 1823 and 1825, Mexico is actually going to pass 3 colonization laws. They're trying to offer cheap land to anyone willing to immigrate to, Mexican Texas. Okay. And so they're going to grant immigrants a 10-year exemption from paying taxes. If there's one thing we know about Americans, it's the fact that we love to not pay taxes, right? So that's going to start to get a lot of white Americans to move there, but there's going to be some guidelines for that. For one thing, it's going to require American immigrants to adopt Mexican customs, values, and even religion. And Spanish and Mexico's religions are primarily Roman Catholicism, which I've talked at length about how America at this general point does not like Catholicism at all. So that's going to be a really hard pill to swallow for a lot of these immigrants moving there who are more Protestant, who again consider Protestant a rebellion against Catholicism, one in which they take part in. And so actually having to adopt Mexican customs and values and the religion of Mexico, which in this case is Roman Catholicism, is going to be, as I said, a hard pill to swallow for many of these white immigrants who are coming in. And they're also encouraging impresarios or agents, basically contractors, to come in and work and develop the land itself. And Stephen Austin is going to be the most successful of these impresarios. So he founded Washington on the Brazos, so kind of a city and town there, and actually is going to convince 1,500 American families to, hey, come here to immigrate. This is a great place for kind of Americans who are willing to kind of come west to kind of strike it rich and try to create their own lives for themselves. So again, these impresarios are basically, they're trying to get people to invest in Mexican Texas, Mexico that is. And so they're inviting people who maybe have some land to come in, buy up the land, and start to develop it. And again, Stephen Austin is going to be the most successful out of all these guys. Okay. So Americans in Texas are initially recognized as Mexican citizens. However, as I said, their lifestyle and values, and especially their rejection of Catholicism, shows that they're not really taking it seriously. They're not doing what they need to kind of become proper Mexicans, because deep down they're Americans, right? They subscribe to Protestantism largely. They have ideas of value, liberty, freedom, property that are all much more American values than Mexican values. So they're not really getting with the program and not really abandoning the American way of life. They're sticking to that, while Mexico's like, hey, you need to kind of become more like us. And Americans, as always, are going to say, try to stop me, right? So in 1826, a guy by the name of Benjamin Edwards, who's the brother of one of those kind of rich impresarios, Hayden Edwards, is going to lead a rebellion against Mexican authority, and is even going to declare American settlements in Texas that constitute an independent nation. So they're not even saying they're a part of America or they're a part of Mexico. He's saying we should be our own independent nation, kind of in between, and he calls it Fredonia. Okay. But this is going to be broken up pretty quickly and then ignored by the majority of even the white population. However, it is going to scare Mexicans naturally into thinking that there's this larger plot against them in the works. Okay. And in 1830, Mexico makes the pretty big decision to just close its borders to prevent any sort of further immigration. And also, they're against slaves entering the Mexican territory. They're against slavery, and they say, hey, these Americans are trying to come in and bring all their values, Protestantism is something we can maybe barely put up with, even though we don't like. But when it comes to bringing their slaves in, that's something we don't want any part of. Okay. Also, they're taxing goods imported from other nations as well, which is, of course, the U.S. is going to be the biggest one to happen there. And naturally, a lot of these American settlers had moved to Texas, Mexican Texas, and thought, well, we're mostly following the rules, even though a lot of them weren't in terms of actually becoming Catholic and adopting all these lifestyles and values. But they thought, well, we're following the rules. Why are we being punished for this? Okay. And even some who didn't have slaves were scared by the notion of others not having slaves, because some aspire to one day have slaves, which shows you how warped their sense of values were. But many of them said, oh, we don't like this. We still consider ourselves more Americans than we do Mexicans. So this is naturally going to infuriate a lot of these American settlers who had come to Mexican Texas. So settlers are going to meet at several conventions in San Felipe in 1832 and 1833, and they're going to choose Stephen Austin, who, as I said, he was kind of the most influential Texan during this time, as the convention's president. Okay, so in that way, he's almost like the George Washington everybody can get behind of Texas. And he's going to say, hey, Mexico, can you reopen the borders to American immigrants and also maybe loosen all this tax on imports? Because Mexico is not, kind of producing its own things. It's not an growing industrial nation in the same way that the U.S. is. So again, they need to import goods from the U.S. that they need. And so they're going to say, hey, listen, can you loosen that tax on imports so we can get back to business? And that's a picture of Stephen Austin there. And also he's going to say, hey, maybe can we separate Texas from the Mexican state of Coahuila and create a new constitution and designate Austin to travel to Mexico City to try to negotiate this stuff. But on January 3rd of 1834, Austin, on his way to kind of talk there, is going to be arrested and imprisoned for treason, although ultimately released, okay? And this is only going to enrage the situation between these white Texans and these brown Mexicans, and further talks are going to be deemed unnecessary by the Texans, who say, no, we need to organize an army. We need to take Mexico on head on. Okay, so this, in many ways, this is kind of they see themselves as another version of the American Revolution, right? They look back to the American Revolution and say, we need to do the same thing, but specifically here in Texas, that Mexico's the problem. Mexico's trying to keep us down, and so we need to fight back against them. Okay, so in April of 1834, the Mexican president, Antonio López de Santa Anna, is going to denounce his own nation's constitution and effectively declare himself an emperor. So this has really, at first, it seemed like nothing to do with Texas. This is what's going on in Mexico. So Santa Anna declares himself, again, he says the Constitution's null and void and himself as the emperor. That's going to further complicate this deteriorating situation. And in general, the Mexican army is going to be largely disorganized. They're not going to have a lot of sound leadership, training, and support. But, and that's going to give the Texan army that was raised, the Texans militias, a little bit of a good head start. And they're going to enjoy their very first taste of victory at Gonzales, which was a military outpost about 75 miles east of San Antonio. But then we have the very famous battle, the Alamo. And I'm sure you've heard of that. Remember the Alamo. Santa Anna is going to organize a force of about 1,800 troops to put down this rebellion. And real quickly, let me say this. What was the Alamo? It was an old Spanish mission, so kind of an old Spanish church that had long been built kind of some years before. And this was an outpost being used by the white Texans who were looking to kind of make a big stand there. And they're going to be greatly outnumbered, okay, because when they arrive the Mexicans arrive at San Antonio in February of 1836, only 180 Texans against 1,800 Mexican troops, okay, which is, a 10-1 margin. So it's like 10 people going to fight one person. And those Texican rebels are going to hold themselves up in an Alamo, which is, again, as I said, was an abandoned Catholic mission. So they're going to be commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William B. Travis. And the whole goal is we need to kind of hold the Mexicans here as long as possible. So General Sam Houston, who's going to be a very important Texan leader moving forward, so he can have time to better train his army to come and help us out, a more experienced force. Okay, so these poor 180 Texans are trying to hold off Santa Anna's army as long as possible so Sam Houston can give his army more time to train. So they're going to hold off a pretty sizable force. Again, 180 Texans versus 1,800 troops. They're vastly outnumbered, but they do hold their own for some time and are going to kill or wound about 600 Mexicans before ultimately they're all going to be brought down and defeated. And again, it's going to buy Houston's army an extra 2 weeks, which is an incredible amount of time that they're going to be afforded. That really helps out it really helps out Houston's army. So again, remember the Alamo is kind of one of the most famous defeats in some ways, and not just American history, but specifically Texas history. But it's kind of one of those things like a Valley Forge, where it was a defeat of sorts, but it was actually a great morale booster for others, right? That it was something that gave a lot of credence and a lot of hope to the Texan cause, because they said, well, even though they all went down, those 180 Texans are going to wound or kill 600 Mexicans, right? So it's going to be something that gets a lot of people fired up on the Texas side, even if they did go down. And again, it was a morale booster, and also on a practical level, it helped Houston get 2 more weeks to better train his army. And so again, remember the Alamo, very kind of famous phrase in Texas history that extends in its own way to American history. So the Battle of Goliad is going to take place soon after that. And this is another costly defeat by Texas, as it turns out. And Mexican firing squad is actually going to execute more than 300 men who were taken prisoner. Okay. But like with the Alamo, this is going to unite Texans against a common enemy all across the territory, and that enemy is Santa Anna. Then you have the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, where an overconfident Santa Anna is going to order his men to rest in the afternoon, halting what could have been a big breakthrough victory over Houston's forces. So him and Houston were kind of going head to head, and kind of foolishly, Santa Anna said, oh, we'll rest in the afternoon, take ourselves a little siesta, and then get back to it the next day. And so Houston and his men understood what was going on, and so he's going to launch a surprise attack, which is going to catch Santa Anna off guard. And the battle, as it turns out, is going to last less than 20 minutes, so a very brief amount of time, but the killing is going to go on for hours. So pretty quickly, they're going to overwhelm these guys and save the day. But they're going to take a lot of these Mexicans prisoner, and they're going to kind of execute them quite brutally over the course of the next several hours. And they're using guns, but also knives and clubs. They're chanting, remember the Alamo, and remember Goliad. So that's really where remember the Alamo is a phrase comes up that, hey, we may have lost that, but we're inspired by them, and we're not going down without a fight, most certainly. So very brutally, these poor Mexican prisoners of war are going to be executed. Okay. Santa Anna himself is also going to be captured, but they're not going to do anything to him except intimidate him. And he's going to be forced to sign a treaty that officially recognizes Texas as an independent nation. Okay. That little Michael Scott meme there is blocking the way. It says 900 Texans over the hillside. Remember the Alamo, Santa Anna. Should have burned the place down when I had the chance 18 minutes before the fattest yeehaw in history, right? So this is a massive victory for Texas. And it's weird. You might not really know this. Some Americans don't, that there is a brief amount of time where Texas is actually this independent nation before it actually becomes an American state. Okay. So, and that's going to be a lot of debate within Texas. Do we want to be an independent nation, or do we want to join the United States? For a brief period of time, they're going to defeat Santa Anna and successfully be their own independent nation. And again, this is kind of what the Battle of San Jacinto looked like. Again, very brutal. It was pretty quick. It was clear that Texas was going to win the battle. But again, very brutally, they're going to execute a lot of these Mexican prisoners of war for several hours. So September of 1836, the Texans are going to elect Sam Houston as their very first president. And they're going to kind of 3,277 versus 91. That's a massive number, right? Are going to vote in favor of annexation, which means that they want to become part of the United States. but as a slave state. And that's going to, as you can imagine, further complicate things when we've been talking about free and slave states. So they want to join as a slave state. Okay. They assumed this wouldn't be an issue at all, that Americans had largely supported Texas during the war. We kind of saw Texas as a little bit of a spinoff of the United States because we had so many white settlers who were down there who were former Americans. So they thought, hey, America overwhelmingly support us. That's not going to be a problem for us to join. Okay. However, as you can imagine, Northern members of Congress are going to say, wait a minute, we had an even split, right? We had the same amount of slave and the same amount of free states. This is going to complicate things and make it even more support, even greater for, the slave states, right? President Jackson, he was president at the time, kind of in the last days of his presidency. He doesn't really want to increase any North and South tensions and risk some kind of a costly war with Mexico, because he knew that recognizing Texas was going to put kind of more tensions between us and Mexico. So he wasn't really sure. So as it turns out, Jackson himself, now he wanted Texas to join, but he realized this is going to complicate things between the North and South. I don't know if I really want to do that. So he's not going to move towards annexing in the last days of his presidency. Though he did sign a resolution recognizing Texas as an independent nation during the last days of his presidency. But when Martin Van Buren's going to take office, we are going to see Texas eventually join as a slave state. Okay, so Texas is, for this brief period of time, an independent nation, an independent republic, but it very much wants to join the United States. But it's not just about them joining as a slave state, as you can imagine, further complicates the situation between North and South. Okay, so that does it for us today. We're going to be getting into even more complicated stuff over the next few lectures. But as always, this is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. Take care.